Ethan's fingernails turned purple, rotting, blackening, like death creeping up his arms. The lab report said, genetic anomaly, but the mirror showed a corpse from the 1920s staring back. Then the subway lights flickered, and the man in the tattered wool suit stepped forward. His ancestor, solid as iron, reaching for him with skeletal fingers. The train doors hissed shut behind him. No way out. The file in his laptop bag was his only hope. But the dead don't let go that easily. His reflection grinned. Wrong, too wide, too many teeth. The last text from Dr. Henderson's phone flashed on screen. He's already dead. Run. The blue light of the monitor hummed, casting Ethan's shadow against the peeling wallpaper of his study. He gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, his breath hitching as he scrolled through the sequence data. The sequences on the screen mirrored the nightmare, blooming beneath his cuticles. He lifted his hand, tilting it toward the desk lamp. The nails had transitioned from a bruised plum to a necrotic, oil-slick purple. He pressed a thumb against his forearm. The skin didn't bounce. It crinkled like ancient parchment, translucent enough to reveal the spiderweb of blackening veins beneath. It rustled, a dry, papery sound that set his teeth on edge. Not possible, he whispered, the words catching on a throat that tasted of copper. He tapped the screen, highlighting the genetic aberrations. The markers identified in the lab report, the ones labeled Subject 4 Alpha, aligned perfectly with his own biological drift. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple, stinging his eye. He reached for his coffee mug, but his fingers slipped. The ceramic shattered against the floorboards. Ethan stared at the brown stain spreading across the rug. He tried to clench his fist, but the parchment skin tightened, threatening to tear at the knuckles. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a trapped bird seeking exit. The cursor blinked, steady and indifferent, illuminating the final line of the report. Accelerated cellular decay imminent. He gripped the armrest, the wood grain rough against his failing palm, as the silence of the house grew heavy. Subverted. Phase 1. Smart decision. Ethan stared at the screen, his mind racing through the logic he had spent a decade perfecting as a software architect. To solve a bug, one needed the source code. He decided the most rational, intelligent course of action was to download every scrap of raw data from the lab's secure portal and cross-reference it with his own family's digitized records. He had spent months digitizing his grandfather's journals and the old Miller estate papers. By running a comparison between the modern lab findings and the historical health records of his ancestors, he could isolate the exact moment this glitch entered the family line. It was a brilliant, data-driven approach. If he could find the origin point, he could find the solution. He felt a surge of professional confidence. He wasn't a victim of a curse, he was a technician facing a complex system error. Phase 2. False positive. The progress bar on his screen crawled toward completion. Match found, 99.8%. Ethan felt a wave of profound relief wash over him, cooling the fever in his blood. The data didn't just match. It provided a roadmap. A specific file titled 1892_Oakhaven_disposition popped up, containing a sequence that looked like a precursor to his own. I have it, he breathed, his shoulders finally dropping from their defensive hunch. The trembling in his hands subsided. He had the evidence. He had the map. The mystery was no longer a ghost. It was a set of coordinates in Nebraska and a string of biological markers. He felt like he had just cracked the most difficult encryption of his career. He was going to live. Phase 3. The crack. He clicked into the 1892 file. expecting to find a medical diagnosis or a chemical exposure report. Instead, the screen flickered. The cooling fan in his laptop began to whine, a high-pitched scream that vibrated through the mahogany desk. A scent began to fill the room, not the ozone of a hard drive, but the heavy, cloying smell of wet earth and ancient, stagnant water. He noticed a small icon in the corner of the document, a symbol that looked less like a medical logo and more like a hand-drawn circle of blood. His skin, which had seemed to stabilize, suddenly rippled. A sharp, stinging pain shot through his chest, as if a needle had just threaded through his heart. Phase 4. Full collapse. The data on the screen began to liquefy. Literally. The black text of the report started to run down the monitor like melting tar. Ethan lunged for the keyboard, trying to close the file, but the keys were searing hot, smelling of scorched dust. He realized with a jolt of pure horror that the lab report wasn't just a record of his condition, it was the trigger for it. By accessing the source code, he hadn't found a cure, he had completed the sequence. The screen flashed a brilliant, sickly violet, and a message appeared in a font that looked like it had been scratched into the glass with a jagged fingernail. Debt acknowledged. The purple under his nails spread instantly to his first knuckles. The parchment skin on his forearms tore open with a sound like a dry leaf snapping, revealing not muscle, but a dark, pulsing rot that hummed with a low-frequency vibration. He hadn't outsmarted the system. He had walked into a digital trap designed specifically for his curiosity. The very act of seeking the truth had accelerated the decay by a factor of 10. He tried to stand, but his leg dragged, the bone feeling like lead. He was no longer just a man with a disease. He was a vessel for a century-old hunger that he had just invited into his home. The data hadn't saved him. It had signed his death warrant. He stumbled out of the office, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He needed a human voice. He needed Robert. He grabbed his coat, the fabric feeling like sandpaper against his raw skin, and headed for the door. The Chicago subway station was a throat of concrete and steel, swallowing thousands of commuters into its humid, electric gullet. Ethan stood on the edge of Platform 4, his hand buried deep in his pocket to hide the necrotic stain of his fingers. The air smelled of ozone and hot metal, a bitter taste that coated his tongue. Every few seconds, he checked the pulse at his neck. 1, 2, 3. Restarting the count if the roar of an approaching train broke his concentration. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out, hoping for a call back from Dr. Henderson. But the screen was a mess of static and sepia-toned shadows. A sudden chill, colder than the air-conditioned draft of the tunnels, prickled the back of his neck. He turned. Standing by a thick concrete pillar was a man who didn't belong in the 21st century. He wore a tattered wool coat, heavy with the smell of damp soil, and his jaw hung at a slight, unnatural angle. It was Silas. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat, hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Silas didn't speak. He simply stepped forward, his movements jerky and rhythmic, mirroring Ethan's own counting. Before Ethan could scream, the specter lunged. Silas's hands, cold as river ice and hard as iron, clamped around Ethan's throat. The strength was impossible, a crushing weight that forced the air from Ethan's lungs in a pathetic wheeze. The struggle was a blur of violence and sensory overload. Ethan's back slammed against the tiled wall, the impact vibrating through his decaying spine. He clawed at the phantom's arms, but his fingers slipped off the tattered wool. The commuters around them were a smear of indifferent motion, seemingly blind to the life-and-death struggle happening in the shadows of the pillar. Ethan felt his vision begin to dim, the edges of the station flickering like a failing light bulb. In a desperate surge of adrenaline, he swung his heavy laptop bag, the corner of the brick-like power supply catching Silas square in the temple. The specter recoiled, his grip loosening just enough for Ethan to draw a jagged breath. Silas let out a low, vibrating hum that sounded like a funeral dirge. He lunged again, but Ethan was faster this time, fueled by a primal terror. He shoved the bag into Silas's chest, using the momentum to propel the figure backward. Silas stumbled, his boots scraping against the yellow safety strip of the platform. With a final, desperate heave, Ethan pushed. Silas tumbled over the edge just as the headlights of the Red Line train illuminated the dark tunnel. There was no scream, only a sickening thud and the shriek of metal brakes on electrified tracks. A shower of sparks erupted, the lights in the station flickering and dying for a heartbeat. When they flickered back on, the tracks were empty. No body, no blood, only the lingering scent of copper and old earth. The train doors hissed open. Ethan threw himself inside, his legs shaking so violently he nearly collapsed. He huddled into a corner seat, his chest heaving. As the train pulled away, he pulled out his phone. A new file had appeared, a cryptic map of a homestead in Oak Haven, Nebraska. Then, a text message arrived from Dr. Henderson's number. His heart soared for a second, then plummeted. "Ethan, this is Sarah Jenkins. I'm a historian Robert hired to help with your family records. Robert is dead, Ethan. They found him in his lab an hour ago. You're the only one left. Get out of the city, now." The train sped into the dark, leaving the screaming city behind. Ethan stared at his reflection in the dark window. The face looking back wasn't his own. It was paler, the eyes sunken, the jaw beginning to tilt at that same unnatural angle. He began to count. 1, 2, 3. He had to keep moving. If he stopped counting, the heart would stop. If he stopped moving, the rot would win. The transition from the vertical concrete of Chicago to the horizontal infinity of the Midwest was a slow, agonizing blur. Ethan's car, a silver sedan that now felt like a rolling coffin, hummed across the Nebraska state line under a sky that was too big, too gray, and too indifferent. By the time he reached the outskirts of Oak Haven, the rain was a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof, matching the tack-tack-tack of his own frantic internal clock. He pulled into the gravel lot of a roadside diner, the neon sign flickering "Eats" in a sickly pink hue. Sarah Jenkins was waiting in a corner booth, her thick-rimmed glasses fogged from the humidity. She didn't look like a savior. She looked like a woman who hadn't slept in 3 days, her arms crossed tightly over a satchel that smelled faintly of old wool and lavender. As Ethan slid into the booth, the leather groaned under his weight. He tried to speak, to thank her, but his tongue felt like a thick, heavy slab of meat in his mouth. It tasted of formaldehyde, bitter and medicinal. "You look worse than the photos Robert sent," Sarah whispered, her voice a sharp, academic rasp. She didn't reach out to touch him. She didn't offer a tissue. She simply pushed a digital recorder toward the center of the table. "Start from the beginning. Every symptom, every vision." "The 1, 2, the data," Ethan managed, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "The file, Nebraska. Why here?" Sarah clicked her tongue against the roof of her mouth. "Because Oak Haven isn't just a town, Ethan. It's a crime scene that never closed. Your great-great-uncle Silas didn't just disappear. He was erased. And according to the records I found in the university archives, he wasn't the only one." She paused, her eyes darting to his hands. "Your skin, Ethan. It's happening faster, isn't it?" Ethan looked down. A gray ribbon of skin, thin as tissue paper, had sloughed off his forearm and lay coiled on the formica tabletop like a dead snake. He tried to brush it away, but his fingers were clumsy, the purple rot now reaching his palms. At that exact moment, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock behind the counter stopped. A heavy, vacuum-like silence descended over the diner. The other patrons, a trucker, a young woman with pink hair and an old man in a seed cap, all froze. Ethan looked at the clock. 7:20 p.m., or, in military time, 1920. The year Silas died. The smell of wet earth suddenly filled the room, overpowering the scent of grease and burnt coffee. It was heavy, suffocating, as if the floorboards were made of grave soil. The waitress, Jennifer, dropped a plate. The ceramics shattered, but she didn't move to clean it. She was staring at Ethan's face, her eyes wide with a primal, inherited fear. "Monster," she whispered, the word carrying across the silent room like a gunshot. "We have to go," Sarah said, her voice low and urgent. She grabbed her satchel, inhaling deeply from the old scarf tucked inside. "Now, Ethan," but the room was already moving. The trucker stood up, his hand reaching for a heavy tire iron tucked into his belt. The old man's eyes were no longer dull, they were bright with a predatory intensity. This wasn't just a town reacting to a stranger. This was a cell response. Oakhaven was an organism, and Ethan was a virus it had been trained for a century to kill. They burst through the double doors into the torrential rain. Behind them, the diner erupted into shouts. "He's back! The Miller rot is back!" Ethan scrambled into the passenger seat of Sarah's rugged SUV, his motor skills failing him. His left leg was a dead weight, a piece of timber he had to haul into the footwell. Sarah slammed the car into gear, the tires screaming on the wet gravel. Behind them, 2 sets of headlights snapped on. Heavy, rusted pickup trucks with brush guards that looked like iron teeth. "Hold on," Sarah yelled, swerving onto a narrow tractor path that cut through the towering corn. The chase was a nightmare of jolting impacts and blinding flashes of light. The corn stalks, 10 feet high and thick as clubs, slapped against the windows with a sound like rapid-fire applause. Ethan gripped the dashboard, his parchment skin tearing at the knuckles. 1, 2, 3. He counted, his voice a frantic whisper against the roar of the engine. Sarah drove with a desperate, jerky precision, her eyes fixed on the muddy ruts of the path. "They won't stop," she panted, pushing her glasses up her nose. "To them, you're not a man. You're a debt that hasn't been paid. The vigilantes, their grandfathers did this. They think if they finish the job, the town stays safe." One of the trucks lunged forward, ramming their rear bumper. The SUV fishtailed, the tires spinning in the black, grabbing mud. Ethan felt the impact in his teeth. He looked out the back window and saw Michael Wright, a man with a jagged scar and a camouflage jacket, leaning out of the passenger window of the lead truck. He wasn't holding a phone or a camera. He was holding a shotgun. "Turn right," Ethan shouted, seeing a break in the stalks. "He won't follow. Michael won't turn left." Sarah didn't ask how he knew. She yanked the wheel. The SUV plunged deeper into the labyrinth, the mud spraying in great, dark arcs. The trucks behind them braked hard, their headlights sweeping the corn as they began a long, circuitous route to intercept. Finally, the engine of the SUV groaned and died, the nose buried in a deep drift of silt. Silence returned, broken only by the pinging of the cooling metal and the distant, rhythmic rustle of the corn. Sarah slumped over the wheel, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached into her bag, buried her face in the lavender-scented scarf for 3 seconds, and then looked at Ethan. She pulled a folder from her satchel. Real paper, yellowed and brittle. "I found it," she said, her voice trembling. "The records the town tried to burn. It wasn't a disappearance, Ethan. It was a massacre. The whole town, the ancestors of everyone in that diner, they dragged Silas and his brothers to the hallowed ground. They didn't just kill them. They buried them in the foundations of their own homes to bind the evil to the land." Ethan stared at the documents. His own name, or a version of it, was scrawled in the margins of a 19th century ledger. "The DNA test," he whispered, the formaldehyde taste growing stronger. "When I sent my sample to the lab, it was like a signal, a beacon." "It's a genetic deadlock," Sarah said, her eyes filling with a terrifying clarity. "The curse didn't start with you, Ethan. It was waiting for you. You are the perfect match. The debt isn't just history, it's biological, and it's coming due." The storm intensified, the wind through the corn sounding like 1,000 voices whispering the same name. Miller. 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 They walked the final mile to the farmhouse, Ethan's body a failing machine. The house loomed out of the dark like a bleached skull, its wood peeling in gray strips that matched the skin on Ethan's arms. Inside, the air was thick with the suffocating smell of mothballs and stagnant time. There were no mirrors, only black, oil-painted rectangles where glass should be. "Down," Ethan rasped, his eyes glazing over. "The cellar, he's there." Ancestral memories, dark and oily, flooded his mind. He wasn't Ethan anymore. He was a bridge. He led Sarah to the kitchen, his fingers tracing the outline of a hidden trap door beneath the linoleum. They descended into a space that felt like being buried alive. Damp earth walls, a low ceiling that forced them to hunch, and a constant rhythmic plink of water into a rusted bucket. Subverted Phase 1. Smart decision. Ethan saw the false brick wall in the corner, the mortar crumbling and dry. Based on the architectural logic of the era, this was where a cold cellar, or a hidden vault, would be placed. He picked up a heavy iron crowbar leaning against a support beam. "The truth is behind this," he told Sarah, his voice gaining a sudden, desperate strength. "If we find the original will, or the record Silas hid before they took him, we can prove the town's guilt. We can break the narrative. Logic dictates that a curse built on a lie cannot survive the light of the truth." He felt a surge of purpose. He was going to use his hands to break the physical barrier and his mind to break the metaphysical one. It was the most logical way to end the nightmare. Phase 2. False positive. The bricks gave way with a satisfying, heavy thud. Behind the wall sat a small, iron-bound chest. Ethan pried it open, his heart racing. Inside were stacks of perfectly preserved documents and a rusted silver locket. Sarah grabbed the papers, her eyes scanning the elegant 19th century script. "Ethan, this is it. It's a full confession from the town sheriff, dated 1893. He details exactly where the bodies are, who held the ropes, everything. This is the evidence we need to end the Miller debt forever. The truth is out." Ethan felt a massive weight lift from his chest. The rot on his arm seemed to pale, the purple receding slightly. They had won. They had the kill code for the curse. Phase 3. The crack, Sarah turned the page of the ledger, her brow furrowing. "Wait," she whispered. "There's a postscript, added later." She stopped, her finger hovering over a line of dark, jagged ink. Ethan leaned in, but as he did, the locket in the chest began to vibrate. It didn't just shake. It hummed with a low, bone-deep frequency that made Ethan's teeth ache. The scent of the cellar changed instantly. The damp earth was replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. He looked at his hand, the one holding the crowbar. The skin wasn't just peeling anymore. It was turning a deep, bruised black, and the veins were pulsing in time with the locket's hum. Phase 4. Full collapse. "Ethan, get away from it!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. She read the final line aloud, her voice trembling with horror. "The truth is not a shield, but a signature. He who finds the record accepts the burden. The blood of the finder shall wash the stone." Ethan realized with a soul-crushing jolt that the hidden records weren't a way out. They were the final stage of the ritual. By breaking the wall and opening the chest, he hadn't found the truth. He had accepted the inheritance. The documents began to glow with a faint, sickly light, and the locket snapped open, revealing a lock of hair that began to writhe like a nest of worms. The rot on Ethan's chest erupted. A network of black, thorny veins burst through his shirt, reaching out like searching fingers. He realized he had been played by his own ancestors. They hadn't hidden the truth to be found by a hero. They had hidden it as a trap for the one descendant smart enough to look for it. He was now the official keeper of the debt. The documents didn't prove his innocence. They marked him for burial. He fell to his knees, the crowbar clattering to the floor. He hadn't broken the curse. He had just signed the contract in his own blood. He was now more a part of this cellar than he was a resident of Chicago. "Well done, cousin," a voice boomed from the stairs. Thomas Miller stepped into the cellar, a double-barreled shotgun leveled at Ethan's chest. He looked pristine, silver hair perfectly coiffed, his eyes unblinking in the harsh beam of Sarah's flashlight. He smelled of high-grade antiseptic, a sharp, medicinal scent that cut through the rot. "You really are a Miller," Thomas said, his voice a warm, fatherly baritone. "Always looking for the why, always trying to code your way out of a heartbeat. You, 1, 2. You knew," Ethan gasped, his lungs feeling like they were filling with wet sand. "I'm the fixer, Ethan. My branch of the family realized a long time ago that you don't fight the rot. You manage it." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the pulsing black veins on Ethan's chest. "Every generation, the debt comes due. Someone has to carry the weight so the rest of us can live in the sun. I've kept Oakhaven quiet for 40 years by making sure the right Millers found their way back to this cellar." "You sacrificed them," Sarah said, her voice a cold, sharp blade. She moved toward Ethan, but Thomas shifted the gun toward her. "I preserved the family, Miss Jenkins. A few lives for a century of peace. It's a simple calculation. Even Ethan should appreciate the math." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bottle of antiseptic. He began to wash his hands 1, 2, 3 times, the liquid dripping onto the muddy floor. Ethan is the perfect host. He's got the logic, the drive, and the perfect genetic sequence. Once Silas fully takes him, the debt is settled for another 50 years. Ethan looked at the rusted locket on the floor. It was humming louder now, a physical force that vibrated in his marrow. His body was failing, his heart rate dropping to a sluggish, heavy thrum. But his mind, the part of him that built systems, that understood structural integrity, was still functioning. He lunged. It wasn't a graceful movement. It was a desperate, dying crawl. He grabbed the locket and used it like a knuckle duster, swinging his weighted fist at Thomas's knee. The metal bit into the older man's leg, and Thomas let out a grunt of pain, the shotgun blast splintering a support beam above them. Dust and ancient hay rained down. Ethan didn't stop. He threw his entire weight, the heavy, leaden weight of a dying man, against Thomas's chest. They tumbled into the mud, a chaotic mess of limbs and antiseptic. Ethan struck again, the locket catching Thomas across the temple. The older man went limp, his head hitting a stone pillar with a sickening crack. Ethan collapsed on top of him, his breath coming in shallow, whistling gasps. He could feel Silas behind his eyes now, a cold, dark presence that wanted to turn his vision into a sepia-toned nightmare. "Sarah," he wheezed. "The records. The last page." Sarah scrambled to the ledger, her glasses sliding down her nose. It says the rot can be transferred to a living host of the same blood. Ethan, the veins, they're reaching for him." Ethan looked down. The black thorny tendrils on his chest were pulsing, stretching toward Thomas's unconscious body like vines seeking water. It would be so easy. He could give the debt to the man who had facilitated it. He could live, but as the spirit of Silas began to manifest in his features, his jaw tilting, his eyes darkening, Ethan saw something else in the shadows of the cellar. He saw the bones. The farmhouse groaned. The shotgun blast had weakened the already decaying structure. A crack appeared in the ceiling, and the sound of the storm outside became a deafening roar. "Not Thomas," Ethan whispered, his logic finally aligning with a truth he hadn't seen in the data. "The brother, Silas's brother, he's the anchor." He used his knowledge of structural loads, his eyes scanning the sagging beams and the way the mud was shifting under the weight of the house. If he triggered a collapse here, and here, "Sarah, get out!" he screamed, his voice a guttural roar that wasn't entirely his own. He grabbed the iron crowbar and struck the base of the central support pillar. Once, twice. On the third strike, the wood shrieked and snapped. The ceiling of the cellar began to buckle, and as the earth shifted, a wall of mud collapsed, revealing a hidden cavity beneath the foundation. Inside were the remains. Not just one skeleton, but a man buried in a sitting position, his hands still bound with rusted wire. On his finger was a heavy gold signet ring, the Miller crest. "The unburied?" Ethan gasped. The weight of the house came down. Ethan threw himself toward the skeleton, his necrotic hands grabbing the cold, mud-caked bones. He felt a jolt of pure, freezing energy. The debt, the rot, the memory, all of it flowing through him and into the earth. He dragged the remains out of the collapsing cellar, hauling them through the mud and the rain, his body screaming in a way that felt like life returning. He reached the edge of the property, the hallowed ground where the blank headstone stood in the pattern of a city he used to know. He dug. He didn't use a shovel. He used his hands, the parchment skin tearing and bleeding. But the blood was red now. Bright, hot, human red. He buried the bones in the center of the pattern, under a sky that was finally beginning to break. As the last handful of earth fell, the cold presence in his mind vanished. The purple under his nails faded to a dull bruise. The parchment skin on his arms didn't disappear, but it stopped tearing. It became scars, thick, silver lines that told a story. Ethan sat on the porch of the farmhouse as the sun began to bleed through the Nebraska clouds. The silence was absolute. No whispers, no counting. Just the sound of his own heart, beating a steady, imperfect rhythm. Sarah sat beside him, her satchel empty of records, her hand resting near his, but not quite touching. "We survived," she said, her voice small against the vastness of the fields. "I spent my life thinking the world was made of code," Ethan said, looking at his scarred palms. "That if you had enough data, you could solve anything. But some debts aren't in the numbers. They're in the dirt. They're in the things we try to forget." He looked back at the house. Thomas Miller was gone. Fled into the night or buried in the mud, it didn't matter. The cycle was broken. A week later, Ethan stood in his Chicago apartment. The city was still screaming, still vibrating with the indifferent energy of millions of lives. He looked at the large, ornate mirror in his hallway, the one he had bought when he thought his life was perfect. He picked up a heavy glass paperweight and smashed it. Then he moved to the bathroom and smashed that one too. He didn't need to see his reflection to know who he was. He carried his history on his skin now. He was a Miller, a man of logic who had been humbled by the ghost of his own blood. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop. The screen hummed, that familiar blue light filling the room. He didn't look at the genetic reports. He didn't check the data. Instead, he began to write a different kind of record, one that wouldn't be stored in a cloud or protected by an algorithm. He began to count, but this time he wasn't counting to stay alive. He was counting the days until he could finally stop looking back. 1, 2, 3. The code was closed. The debt was paid. But Ethan Miller knew that in the dark corners of the world, where the earth meets the foundation, the past is always waiting for someone to start counting again.